Mr. Boopathy, Mary Rose Tobin. Mr. Boopathy navigated across the busy street and turned his taxi into the narrow lane at the side of the hotel. With practiced agility, he guided his car over the dusty potholes. Glad of the brief respite from the sun's rays, he crawled along, careful not to damage the paintwork on his gleaming Toyota, his pride and joy. He emerged into the crowded car park at the rear of the Taj Hotel. Greeting his fellow drivers, he stripped off his blue shirt. It had absorbed his sweat all day. Now it lay in a damp heap on the front seat of the car. Then he removed the white calico seat covers, made a bundle of the clothes, and filled a basin with water. This was the part of the day he most enjoyed. His friend Raju gave him a cool bottle of water. He scrubbed his laundry and chatted about the events of the day. "Tomorrow," said Boopathy, "I start a 2-week service." "Lucky bastard," said Raju. "A 2-week commission is rare enough these days. Where is he from?" "They," corrected Boopathy. "A couple from New York." "Business or tourists?" asked Raju. "A bit of both, I think," answered Boopathy. "He has family roots in Tamil Nadu, and she wants to see the sights. Retired, I think." "Oh, you are a lucky bastard, Boo. Plenty of American dollars, yes? You will be extra nice to them, yes?" "I'm always nice." "You are, Boo. Even with the worst of them, you manage to keep your patience. I don't know how you do it. Sometimes I could scream at the things these people ask me to do. They look at us as if we are inferior, as if we are below them. Fucking Westerners." "Now, Raju, you can't live your life in hate. Make the best of what you have got. Everyone has troubles. It does not matter whether you are rich or poor." Boopathy was at Bangalore Airport bright and early the next morning. The flight from New York was delayed, but he remained at his post, holding up the sign that said, "George and Ruby Patterson." When the crowd started to spill out from the arrivals area, Boo stood on tiptoe and elbowed his way to the front barrier. He was not going to get off on the wrong foot with his new clients. A red-haired lady of indeterminate age, wearing a bright yellow sundress, emerged. Her sunglasses were perched on top of her head, and her red lipstick shone, but it was her loud voice that made her stand out. Following in her wake was a man of similar age, wheeling a trolley laden with suitcases. He wore a Panama hat and a heavy Western business suit. With his harassed eyes, he cast worried glances, first ahead to the arrivals area, and then back to his unencumbered wife. "George and Ruby Patterson!" shouted Boo. "Over here! Over here!" "Oh, look, George, there's our porter," said the woman. "Leave the cases there. Let this Indian look after them from here." George stopped in his tracks. "I think I should bring them at least as far as the exit," he began. "Nonsense!" the woman snapped. "Woo! Woo! Over here, boy! Over here, you foolish man! Can you not see us? He cannot see us, George! Shout at him!" "Give the man a chance, dear. He's blocked by the barrier. We have to go through this exit before he can catch us." The woman sucked in her cheeks and scowled. She took off at pace towards the exit barrier. "Come along, George!" she shouted. "Don't dally!" Boopathy expertly removed the trolley from George's hands. "I am Mr. Boopathy," he said, as he shook the Pattersons' hands warmly and asked them to follow him to the car. "Can't you bring the car to the door?" demanded Ruby. "I'm exhausted after that long flight and I can't walk another step." Boopathy demurred politely. "No, Mrs. Patterson, that, I am afraid, is not permitted." Ruby walked sulkily to the car park, moaning all the while about the heat and the smell. It did not take Boopathy long to get the measure of the Americans, who would be his constant companions for the next 10 days. It was clear that Ruby gave the orders and George snapped to attention. He would have to be on his guard. Their journey would take them from Bangalore to Kochi via the Nilgiri Hills, taking in a combination of cultural sites, wildlife, local life and beautiful scenery. The Pattersons would stay in a new hotel every night. Each leg of the journey was carefully planned in advance, and there was a lot of ground to cover. Mr. Boopathy was an excellent driver and did his best to be good company. Each morning he was at the hotel reception at the appointed time in a freshly washed uniform blue shirt. He kept the interior of the car immaculate. The white calico seat covers were changed daily, and fresh bottles of water appeared as if by magic. Ruby's bad temper and disdain for her surroundings were compensated for by George's pleasant manner. When he wasn't jumping to attention and tending to his wife's demands, however trivial, he bombarded Boopathy with questions. To begin with, Boopathy wasn't giving too much away. It took George a while to acquire the information that their Indian guide was married, with a 21-year-old daughter and a 10-year-old son. At the end of each day, the threesome parted company after checking into the latest hotel. In the early days of the trip, George was uncomfortable at the idea that Boopathy was alone for the long evenings, and invited him to dinner.
"What can you be thinking, George?"
bickered Ruby.
"The servants can't eat with us."
She need not have worried. The invitation embarrassed Boopathy, and he politely refused, saying he preferred to eat and sleep with the other drivers. George assumed that there were staff quarters somewhere in the hotels. When he found out that all the drivers slept in their cars and ate at the local tatukada, a covered cart parked by a roadside selling local street food and frequented by local men, he was mortified. Nothing would do George but to visit a tatukadu and see for himself. Mr. Boopathy was not happy about this.
"I phoned Mrs. Boopathy and told her what you wanted to do," he said, "and she also does not think it a good idea."
But he gamely escorted George there, despite his misgivings, and it was quite a dining experience. George thought it the highlight of the entire tour. Ruby showed no interest, opting to stay back and have the hairdresser come to her room instead. A couple of days into the trip, Mr. Boopathy and George were momentarily alone. Boopathy used the opportunity to make a request. "Perhaps," he said, "you don't need all the toiletries supplied by the hotel each day? And if not, and if you don't mind, could you give them to me to bring to the orphanage?" George didn't mind. He and Ruby had plenty. But the orphanage? When George told this to Ruby, she was outraged.
"Orphanage?"
she snorted.
"Garbage! The guy wants them for his wife and daughter."
For once, George ignored her, and next day he left the small bottles of shampoo, shower gel and conditioner in the side pocket of the back seat. He told Mr. Boopathy just to look there every day, and he would leave what he could. It became their little secret. Once into the Nilgiri Hills, the temperatures dropped very noticeably, and George worried about Mr. Boopathy sleeping in his car. He would be very cold, he thought. To Ruby's intense irritation, he wandered up and down the street market to find Boopathy a fleece blanket. When he presented it to him, it was accepted graciously, but again with obvious embarrassment. As the journey progressed, Mr. Boopathy became chattier and more responsive to George's curious questioning. "Why don't you tell me a bit more about your family?" he asked.
"I will show you my beautiful daughter," Boopathy replied proudly, taking out his phone and scrolling through his photos until he found what he was looking for. Beaming from the upturned photograph was a glamorous young woman in graduate's cap and gown, with Boopathy on one side and a lady who must have been her mother on the other side. "She has just completed her master's degree in HR and is now looking for employment." "Oh, there's a coincidence," said George. "She has the same qualification as you, Rubes." Ruby studiously examined her fingernails. Yes, she also had a master's degree in HR. It was superior, of course, to anything an Indian girl might have. "Clever as well as beautiful," exclaimed George. "Is it usual for girls in South India to be so well educated?" Boopathy's face darkened. "No," he said. "Many girls in South India must put up with discrimination, prejudice, violence and neglect all their lives, whether they are single or married women. It is difficult for them to get a good education unless they come from a wealthy family. As a matter of fact," he went on, "my daughter is adopted. My wife and I decided that we would take a girl from the orphanage and give her a chance in life that she would not have otherwise. She has been a wonderful daughter to us." He paused and was quiet for a moment. "I support her in her decision not to marry right away, but to make a career for herself, even though this is most unusual in our family." He sighed. "My own mother will just have to get used to this." George asked no more questions that day, and Ruby was uncharacteristically quiet. Towards the end of the tour, the itinerary took in a walk to the Redemptorist School in Connaught, where George's father had been a pupil before the First World War. Ruby and George were surrounded by excitable boys and girls, just about to break up for their winter holiday. The students chattered in passable English, each with a torrent of questions about life in New York. "Let us have some selfies with you," they demanded. When the journey recommenced, George asked Mr. Boopathy to tell him more about his son. "He is almost 10 years old," he replied. "As a matter of fact, it's his birthday next week." "Oh," George said. "Will you have a party for him?" "No," Boopathy replied. "On his birthday every year we have a special family tradition." "What's that?" enquired George. "Well, we collect together the ingredients to make a big meal, and we go as a family to the orphanage and cook for the orphans," replied Boopathy. "It is my way of showing my son how fortunate he is. He comes from a loving family and will have many chances in life. Why should he party while other children go hungry?" "Did you do that last year?" asked George. "Do you have a photo we can see?" "Sure," said Boopathy, producing his phone with a flourish. "Here is my wife, my daughter, my son, and some of the orphanage children." George was fascinated by this insight into Boopathy's family life and looked at Ruby for her reaction. She wouldn't believe a word, he thought. He was surprised to see her dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. That evening over dinner, George was a bit worried about his unusually subdued wife. "What's the matter, Rubes?" he cajoled. "Sad that tomorrow's our last day?" "No," she said quietly. "I'm sad that I didn't believe Boopathy about the toiletries for the orphanage." Next day at the airport, George studied his wife carefully. She politely thanked Mr. Boopathy for holding the car door open for her. They had agreed at breakfast on a generous tip for Boopathy. Ruby handed him 2 envelopes at the departure gate. "Mr. Boopathy," she said,
I thank you with all my heart for your company on this journey. You have been knowledgeable, polite, and always prepared to go the extra mile to make our days as full and interesting as possible." She lowered her eyes and scuffed her feet on the dusty floor. Then she looked up at Boopathy. "Through you," she went on, "I learned the most unexpected things, and not always about India. Thank you. I will never forget you." George was puzzled. As they passed through departures, he quizzed Ruby. "2 envelopes? What was in the second one?" "Oh, just a little something for the boys' birthday party.